The very moment he sat down, his eyes were completely captivated by the woman before him. He was at the peak of his charm, brimming with confidence, and so he proactively struck up a conversation. Although it felt a bit sudden, in the presence of such a gentlemanly and charismatic man, Susan didn't even realize that no matter what he said, she agreed and responded with a radiant smile. As the daughter of a billionaire, she never thought she would feel interested in anyone again. But in everything from their views during the conversation to their coffee habits, this man was perfectly in sync with her. For that very reason, she suddenly developed a strange feeling. Unfortunately, due to work reasons, although neither of them wanted to, they still had to say goodbye. But could this beautiful encounter really be a one-time thing? And so, without even knowing each other's names, they frankly expressed their feelings. It seemed like a confession of love, yet no one took another step, not even offering to exchange names or phone numbers. The two of them just turned and walked away. However, what they didn't know was that when I turned my head, he was walking away. And when he turned his head, I was just retreating back. I thought he had no lingering feelings, and he thought I had no attachment. But in truth, a restless, nagging feeling rose in both their hearts. Perhaps at that moment, they still held a faint hope, believing that fate would give them another chance to meet. Just a few minutes later, the man was in a serious traffic accident. Of course, if their destiny was not over, the story would continue in a different way. Bill Parrish, Susan's father, was the powerful CEO of a large corporation. After a glorious life, he was about to celebrate his 65th birthday. His eldest daughter, Allison, was busy preparing for the party. Lately, Bill had been feeling uneasy. He kept hearing a strange voice whispering in his ear for no reason. So when Allison reported on the party plans, he didn't hear a single word. At dinner with the family, that faint voice continued, and this time it even invited him to the library for a private meeting. Although his heart was filled with anxiety to find out what was really happening, Bill followed the instructions and went into the library. The room was empty. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared from behind a bookshelf, and then that strange but familiar voice spoke again. I existed before mankind was on this world. I was not supposed to be curious about humans, but I have become interested in you. Therefore, before I take you, I want to feel a little of the warmth of human life by your side. At first, Bill was completely bewildered, not understanding what was happening. It wasn't until the other person stepped out of the shadows and reminded him of his health problems that he was suddenly jolted into awareness. Earlier at the office, Bill had suffered a sudden heart attack. Unexpectedly, he recovered shortly after as if nothing had happened. Only now did he realize that he should have died then. It was this young man before him who had let him live, and this man was death itself. It turned out Death wanted to make a deal with Bill. He would grant Bill more time to live on the condition that Bill must always keep him by his side, until he had experienced everything in the mortal realm. During this time, Bill was not allowed to reveal his identity to anyone. Otherwise, the deal would be immediately voided, and Bill would be taken away instantly. For Bill, his whole life had been fulfilled with a happy family and a successful career. There was nothing to regret, even in death. He had long wished to go to heaven to be reunited with his beloved wife. The only thing he couldn't let go of was his two daughters, different in personality, but both shining in their own fields. Bill thought it over and finally made a decision. Instead of departing suddenly and leaving his children in sorrow, he would rather accept Death's offer, using the remaining time to say a proper goodbye. After reaching the agreement, Bill suddenly became curious as to why Death was such a handsome young man. And Death simply said one sentence, "I need a body." Just then, it was dinner time. The two of them came to the dining table, causing everyone else to be extremely surprised. Everyone knew that no outsider had ever had dinner with Bill's family before. Therefore, everyone was curious about this unfamiliar face. However, Bill only introduced each member of his family to Death, but did not introduce Death to his family, because he still hadn't thought of a reasonable excuse, but the family members kept asking. Bill had to firmly say, "This is Joe Black, an important friend of mine." Then he had Joe sit opposite him. The atmosphere at the dinner table suddenly became more awkward than ever, because everyone noticed Bill's stiffness, but no one dared to say it. They could only turn their gazes towards Joe, who was Death. This was the first time Joe had experienced human life, so he behaved like a curious, immature child, inquisitive about everything. While everyone was flustered by his naive actions, Susan, who had just finished work, rushed in. At first, she didn't notice Joe's presence. Only after greeting her father and her boyfriend, Drew, did she see Joe sitting at the dinner table and said in surprise, "Why are you here?" Seeing everyone's confused expressions, she quickly explained what had happened that morning. But when Joe answered her, Susan suddenly felt that although his appearance was exactly the same, his way of speaking and his personality seemed to have completely changed. She thought that after learning of her status, he no longer dared to be as casual as before. But she had no idea that within this familiar body, the soul inside was truly no longer the same one. After the meal, Bill immediately questioned Joe about how he knew his youngest daughter. Joe answered honestly, although there were still many questions, such as why death would inhabit the body of a young man who had only had a chance encounter with his daughter. Bill had more important matters to deal with at the moment. So after taking Joe to his bedroom, he quickly left. As for Joe, with nothing to do and driven by curiosity, he stepped out of the room and began to explore. A little later, he arrived at the kitchen. Seeing that he was an honored guest of the family, the head chef was very welcoming. When he noticed that Joe seemed interested in the jar of peanut butter in his hand, he immediately got a spoon and invited him to have a taste. After confirming that he really liked it, the head chef carefully used a new spoon to scoop another spoonful for him. Just like that, Joe, holding a spoonful of peanut butter, continued to wander through the luxurious mansion that was like a palace. Soon, he reached the swimming pool. Coincidentally, Susan was also swimming there. As a matter of course, the two had their second private conversation. The perfect meeting in the morning, the lingering feeling at their parting, and the strange dinner just now. All of it left Susan full of questions. She said bluntly, "From the first time I met you, I felt a flutter in my heart, a feeling I haven't experienced for a very long time. I used to think you had feelings for me too, but now you're acting so distant. I really want to know why." But Joe was like an uninvolved outsider, engrossed only in licking the peanut butter spoon. Until the spoon was shining, Susan couldn't take it anymore, snatched it away, and placed it on a shelf. Only then did Joe seem to snap out of it and answer Susan's question. "Tonight, I did not mean to be rude to you. I've never been good at communicating with people. Due to the nature of my work, I also don't have time to think about other things." To Death, it was just an objective statement, but to Susan, a person who understood human love, it was nothing short of a polite rejection. Feeling extremely disappointed, she directly said good night and ended the conversation. The next morning, worried that something bad might happen, Bill immediately went to Joe's room. He found him standing in front of the mirror, struggling with his tie. Seeing Bill enter, Joe happily said that he liked his family. Unexpectedly, these words, which sounded like a compliment, startled Bill. He inquired, "I will keep the secret of you being Death, but I also hope you will keep your promise to only take me." It turned out Bill was worried that Death might, on a whim, take his entire family from the world. Only after hearing the other party firmly promise to keep his word did he feel temporarily at ease. Afterwards, because he had to attend a board meeting, Bill took Joe to the company. According to the rules, no one besides internal board members was allowed to attend, but Joe insisted on auditing, so Bill had to break the rule for him. This displeased the other board members, especially Drew, Susan's boyfriend. Currently, Drew was acting as a bridge for another company to acquire Bill's corporation. If successful, he would be promoted quickly. But Bill's attitude had always been ambiguous, never giving a definitive answer. Therefore, he always felt uneasy. When Joe suddenly appeared, Drew became even more fearful, afraid that this person was a spy sent by the competition. Drew didn't know that Bill had no intention of selling his brainchild. Now, knowing his time was running out, he was even more determined to hold on to the career he had painstakingly built. So when Drew brought up the matter again in the meeting, he decisively used his veto power. However, Drew refused to give up, even angrily stating that for the long-term development of the company, merging with a larger, stronger corporation was the best and most beneficial option. He likened it to being as certain as death and taxes. Initially, Joe, who understood nothing of the business world, was just listening for fun. But when the two words "the death" hit his ears, he instantly became alert, curiously asking, "What do death and taxes have to do with each other?" Hearing this, Drew thought he was deliberately causing trouble, and his anger flared even more. He explained while mocking his ignorance. And Joe, throughout the whole thing, only responded with a polite but deadly smile. Seeing the situation spiraling out of control, Bill had to take Joe out of the meeting room. When they returned to the office, Bill again used the excuse of being busy, trying to politely get rid of Joe. Joe also sensed his frustration and turned to leave without hesitation. Immediately after, he teleported to the hospital where Susan worked. Ever since their parting at the pool, Susan had thought they would never have a chance to meet again and had been sad for a long time. So when she saw Joe appear beside her, she appeared calm on the outside, but inside her heart was bursting with joy. Just as they had a chance to talk, a patient was pushed nearby. The old woman, suffering from cancer, recognized Joe's identity with just one look. As her family followed Susan to handle admission procedures, the old woman, both scared and hopeful, asked Joe, "Are you here to take me?" After receiving a negative answer, she tearfully pleaded, "I'm in so much pain. Please release me soon." Normally, death cannot arbitrarily change a person's lifespan, but seeing the old woman in such agony, Jo promised that she would be able to pass on in a few days. After the old woman was wheeled away by her family, Jo also immediately said goodbye to Susan, because at that moment, he understood that the hospital had too many fragile souls. As death, he shouldn't stay here. But Susan thought he was afraid of affecting her work and, naively, she accepted this thoughtfulness. The seed of love in her heart also began to sprout. That evening, Bill unusually invited the whole family to dinner again. Having met during the day, Jo and Susan talked more. Unexpectedly, this made both Drew and Bill feel displeased at the same time. Bill felt that Jo and Susan were getting too close. The two should not interact so much, so he angrily confronted Jo in private. "Why did you go to the hospital to find Susan?" Jo was completely unconcerned with his thoughts and too lazy to answer a question that he himself couldn't explain. Drew, on the other hand, couldn't understand it at all. He was clearly the one dating Susan. He was clearly the one most valued by Bill. But why was it that now that Jo had appeared, everyone seemed to revolve around him? As someone who had always been considered elite, Drew found this hard to accept. So when Susan invited him to dinner the next night, he not only flatly refused, but also immediately broke up with her. In reality, the feelings between them were never deep. Drew was a selfish opportunist. Compared to love, he craved money and power more. If Susan wasn't Bill's daughter, he probably would never have agreed to date her. And Susan had never truly loved Drew either. She only thought Drew was smart, capable, and her father's right-hand man, so she wanted to try getting to know him. Since the man was indifferent, the woman had no intention either. The breakup was clean and decisive, with no lingering feelings or hesitation from either side. On the contrary, upon seeing Jo, Susan had clearly developed an attachment. She was even filled with a desire to explore his elusive persona. "Are you married? Do you have a girlfriend? Or do you not like women?" After receiving negative answers, she moved closer to Jo and asked, "So why is an intelligent and attractive man like you still single?" Faced with this question, Jo, as death, didn't know how to answer and could only use the excuse of going back to his room to escape. On the third day, Drew secretly convened all the board members, beginning to persuade them of the benefits of selling the company and proposing that Bill retire early. That way, his veto power would no longer be valid. At first, everyone disagreed until Drew called in Bill's eldest son-in-law, Quince. It turned out that the previous night, Quince had met with Bill privately to discuss company matters. And from Bill's own mouth, he heard that whether the business plan could be further discussed depended entirely on Jo's thoughts. What Bill meant was that he didn't know if he would live to see that day. Quince, a thoughtless man, was completely unaware and turned around to reveal that statement to Drew. Drew misunderstood that it was Jo who had influenced Bill, making him unwilling to sell the company. So he hastily called this meeting. The board members were also swayed by the phrase, "Everything is decided by Jo," and changed their stances one by one. Having achieved his goal, the next day Drew requested Bill to hold another board meeting. He began to apply pressure, demanding that Bill explain who Jo was, and why someone who wasn't a board member could influence the chairman's decision. Because of his agreement with death, Bill had to remain silent. This was entirely within Drew's calculations. He immediately called for a vote to remove Bill from his position. Only Bill's best friend and Quince disagreed. After the vote concluded, Drew again asked everyone to vote on whether to sell the company. The result was obvious. In the face of all this, Bill didn't say another word and chose to accept it quietly. After the meeting, Quince, who realized what had happened too late, immediately found Drew and cursed him as a sinister and deceitful person. However, Drew was not angry at all. On the contrary, he advised Quince to be pragmatic. Otherwise, he wouldn't make a single penny and would be kicked out the door. Looking at the familiar yet strange man before him, Quince, a very loyal man, declared on the spot that he would expose him. But it was already too late, and besides, Quince was also an accomplice. So no matter how wronged he felt, he had no choice but to accept it. In another turn of events, Jo returned home with Bill and then went to the pool by himself. Suddenly, he remembered how after dinner the previous night, Susan had invited him for a walk. As emotions swelled, the two shared a kiss. That was the first time Jo had tasted the sweetness of a kiss. Under Susan's guidance, death tasted the forbidden fruit of mankind, and Susan also clearly felt that this was Jo's first time. After a passionate night, the two shared a lingering farewell in the grand hall, but that moment was witnessed by Bill. When Susan left, Bill couldn't contain his anger. He could endure and tolerate death's sudden appearance in his life, which had objectively caused turmoil in his company and disrupted his peaceful family. But he could not watch Death fall in love with Susan, and he dared not imagine how desperate Susan would be when Death left. Or worse, that Death would take Susan with him. However, he forgot that Death was not his subordinate and was completely unafraid of his authority. Thus, Bill's seemingly terrifying threat was completely ineffective. On the contrary, Death ordered him to watch his words. Don't forget who is really in charge. The next day, Joe eagerly went to the hospital, planning to bring a bouquet of flowers for Susan. But Susan wasn't at work that day. Instead, she had gone to her father's place to find Joe. The two just missed each other. However, Bill took this opportunity to talk to Susan about Joe. But Susan, who was completely unaware of the truth, kept emphasizing her love for Joe, which made Bill suddenly furious. This was the first time in many years that Bill had vented his anger on Susan. Susan was frightened. Although she didn't know what she had done wrong, she immediately apologized. Then she said, "I love you, Dad," and left sadly. At the same time, Joe, who couldn't find Susan, went to the side of the old woman he had met before. At this point, the old woman was in even more agony from her illness. She begged Joe to take her away immediately. But Joe didn't understand why humans were so contradictory. When he came to take them, they wanted to stay. When he let them live, they wanted to die. He didn't know that human emotions are inherently complex, and when faced with different circumstances, they will also make different choices. Like the old woman now, knowing that sooner or later she had to go, why should she continue to endure the pain? It was better to take beautiful memories and go to the paradise world sooner. When she learned that Joe had fallen in love with Susan, the old woman also soberly advised him, "You don't belong here. Meeting a good person and experiencing love is already a grace that God has bestowed upon you. So, don't ask for too much. Leaving with beautiful memories is the destiny you must accept, and it is also the best choice." Hearing these words, Joe suddenly felt a sense of loss. He had wanted to stay in the human world for a while longer, to enjoy more of the sweetness of love, but then he thought about his original reason for coming here, which was just to experience intense emotions he had never felt before. Now, that purpose had clearly been achieved. It was time for him to return. After thinking everything through, Joe used his powers to let the old woman pass away and then immediately found Bill, telling him that after the 65th birthday party tomorrow night, the two of them would leave this place together. Although he was mentally prepared, Bill's heart still trembled. In any case, what was to come would come. As the helicopter flew over the clear blue lake and landed in front of a castle surrounded by greenery, Bill had arrived at his 65th birthday party, but he still had business to attend to. After explaining the situation to Joe, he went ahead on his own. Joe, with nothing to do, began to stroll around the picturesque island. He suddenly saw Quince sitting alone in a corner, drinking to drown his sorrows. He approached to ask what was wrong, and Quince recounted all his previous mistakes, crying and begging for a solution. Looking at this man who, though not very bright, deeply loved his wife and was very loyal, Joe told him to go directly to Bill and tell him the truth. At first, Quince didn't have the courage until he heard the other person say that Bill would definitely forgive him. He finally made up his mind. At this moment, Bill was acting calm. No one could tell that he had less than 12 hours left to live. Not even his eldest daughter, Allison, who had always respected and loved him the most. To organize a perfect birthday party for her father, Allison had been busy for months, handling every detail, big and small, herself. But even so, she knew her place in her father's heart was not at all equal to her younger sister Susan's. However, she bore no resentment. Because to her, love was love, whether it was a lot or a little, as long as she could feel it, she was content. No calculations, no comparisons, otherwise life would be miserable. Perhaps it was because of her understanding and generous heart that Bill had always overlooked her love and sacrifice. It was only at this moment, as his life was about to end, that Bill realized how neglectful he had been. And for the first time, he sincerely praised Allison. As night fell, brilliant lights illuminated the entire castle. Guests flocked to celebrate the birthday. Yet, in this seemingly lively party, a life and death farewell was about to take place. Ever since hearing from her father that Joe was about to leave, Susan's heart had been torn with pain. She didn't want to sadden her father, but she also didn't want Joe to leave. So when she saw Joe again, she not only said, "I love you," but also earnestly pleaded for him to stay. "I want to be with you forever." But Joe misunderstood her meaning. He thought Susan was willing to leave with him. So after saying goodbye to Susan, he immediately went to find Bill. Bill had also just finished talking with Quince, who had come to apologize. When Quince left, Joe immediately stated his intentions. But what he didn't expect was that this time Bill wasn't angry at all. Instead, he confronted him with sound reasoning. He said that Joe thought he loved Susan, but in reality, Joe didn't understand what love is. Love is understanding, tolerance, trust, and responsibility. Whereas Joe only wanted to possess selfishly. He asserted that Susan didn't really love Joe either, but only loved the young man whose body he possessed. Joe had taken advantage of her feelings. Bill believed that Joe realized this himself and had come to him seeking enlightenment, hoping he would stop him. Although he understood that everything Bill said was true, Joe still wanted to confirm it for himself. He went to find Susan again, preparing to reveal his true identity. Unexpectedly, Susan spoke first. Susan told Joe that from the moment she met him at the coffee shop, she knew she had found the right person. She expressed that if he had to leave, she was willing to go with him or stay here and wait for his return. If Joe were truly the man from the coffee shop, he would have been deeply moved, but he was not. And this sincere confession not only failed to comfort his heart, but also turned into 1,000 silver needles piercing it deeply, causing his heart, which did not know how to beat, to become shattered and desolate. Because at this moment, he finally confirmed that he was just a substitute. The one Susan had loved all along was the original soul of this body. But before leaving completely, he still conveyed his true identity to Susan through a hug. At first, Susan felt a little fear, but very quickly she smiled. Because the initial fear was the body's instinctive reaction upon sensing death, while the subsequent smile was the true emotion for the one she loved. Having overcome her instincts, Susan also understood better than anyone that the one she loved now was the Joe right in front of her, which was why she stubbornly wanted Joe to say those words. "I love you very much now." Unfortunately, Joe was completely unaware of this. After a lingering farewell, Joe returned to Bill's side and told him that tonight, it would still be just the two of them leaving. Bill had long predicted this outcome, because if Joe could experience the passion of love, he could certainly also learn the essence of love. Finally relieved of the burden in his heart, Bill had Quince call Drew in, preparing to resolve the last lingering issue. Before he could even speak, Joe fluently listed Drew's crimes and lied that he was an investigator from the Internal Revenue Service. He hadn't revealed his identity for security reasons. Seeing this, Bill immediately played along. The two of them bantered back and forth, trapping Drew into admitting that he had harmed the company's interests. What was even more brilliant was that Bill had previously called and assembled the entire board of directors. Everyone had watched live and seen Drew's dirty true colors. At first, Drew still tried to resist until Joe threatened him. "If you don't admit your fault and resign, what you will face is not a few years or a dozen years in prison, but thousands of years in endless darkness." Perhaps it was due to the innate intimidation of death, Drew immediately surrendered upon hearing this. But he still didn't believe Joe was an IRS investigator. Joe only replied with one sentence: "Death and taxes." Just like that, with Joe's help, Bill was able to keep his corporation. He had no more regrets in his life. Afterwards, amidst the blessings of many politicians and billionaires, Bill concluded his 65th birthday party. Then he stepped down from the stage and hugged his eldest daughter and son-in-law tightly. When he came to Susan, she had already guessed that he was about to leave. Otherwise, death couldn't stay by his side forever. But such a parting between life and death is not easy for anyone to accept. Bill also noticed his daughter's reluctance, so before leaving, he invited Susan for a dance. At that moment, brilliant fireworks exploded in the night sky, mesmerizingly beautiful. Unfortunately, Bill no longer had the time to leisurely enjoy it with his loved ones. Susan didn't try to hold on any longer, because she couldn't keep him even if she wanted to. She could only shed tears and say her final goodbye to her father. Watching the father and daughter holding each other tightly under the fireworks, Death, who was sitting alone outside the crowd, also felt his eyes well up. When Bill raised his head and walked proudly before him, he looked at this world with longing a few more times, then walked side by side with Bill across the stone bridge, through the darkness, towards a brighter, distant place. Although she was prepared for the separation, watching the two men she loved walk further and further away, Susan still unconsciously chased after them. But when she reached the stone bridge, an elegant young man walked towards her. It turned out that so Susan wouldn't feel lonely, and so her love could be complete, Death had resurrected the man from the coffee shop from the beginning. However, when she realized that the one before her was no longer that mysterious soul, a flicker of disappointment crossed Susan's eyes. But very quickly, she understood something. Wasn't the man in front of her the love she had met from the very beginning? Now that they could rekindle their old flame, she should cherish it and live a good life with him. As for the Death who had infatuated her, after living out this happy life, she would surely meet him again. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching. What do you think of this film?